Hello everyone and welcome to week 4 of our Introduction to Literature class. This week we're going to be looking at the literary element known as theme. It's one of my favorite things to look for in a story, and it's something that we're going to be writing about in a few weeks when we get to the short story theme essay. Now, if you remember from week 1 in the PowerPoint presentation, theme is defined generally as a big idea about life. It's what the author wants to express about what it is to be human, what it is to be alive, or something in our world. And there are a lot of different themes that are common in literature, but also there's a lot of individual themes in individual stories, and a story can have multiple themes. I think most great stories do have multiple big ideas about life. If you think about movies or songs that you listen to, they generally have something they want to express about the world we live in, and that can be defined as theme. So you're going to be reading 3 stories with this theme idea in mind this week. The first one is Bounty by Diane Cook, and I love this story, not only because it's just wonderfully written and imagines a crazy world, but I went to college with Diane and she's a really good friend and I love her writing. She just published her first novel this summer. It's called The New Wilderness. If you're looking for a great book to read, check it out. And she's shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is a huge literary prize in England. It's a huge honor. I'm really proud of Diane. This is a short story that she wrote a few years back. And it can be generally defined as within a new genre that's kind of popping up these days, something called cli-fi fiction, climate change fiction, even though I don't know if she would call it cli-fi fiction. But this is a story that imagines a world where the oceans have risen, governments have fallen apart, cities have fallen away, people are just surviving, and this imagines 2 homes in a neighborhood on a hill that are left standing. She lived in Portland, Maine for a little bit, and she actually imagined the west end of Portland, Maine. If you've ever been to the west end of Portland, Maine, it has these huge brick homes. They're massive, and she was imagining one of those when she wrote it. It's an interesting story, and I find it such a treat to read. The second one is a classic, The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. It's from a bigger book called The Things They Carried, which is about 10 short stories. This is one of those short stories in that book. Tim O'Brien served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He was an infantryman, and he wrote about his experience, still continues to write about his experiences being a soldier in Vietnam. This is a classic story about that. It's a long story. It's about 20 pages. It has a lot of detail, but we'll talk about that detail next week, I think, when we get into symbols and symbolism, because there's some interesting symbolism being utilized by Tim O'Brien in that story. The third one is by Sherman Alexie. He wrote, this is what it means to say Phoenix, Arizona, with Victor and Thomas in their road trip to Arizona. This is another one of his stories. Early in his career, called The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, and it's a sad story, but I think a prevalent one, certainly even in today's world. It's a very important story to read. So The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven is the third one. You got a reading quiz and a discussion due as well. Let's get into theme. Alright, so theme is the general idea or insight about life that the entire story reveals. It's what the happenings, the events add up to. It's the center, the moving force, the principle of unity. Another way I've described it before is, and this sometimes makes sense but sometimes doesn't, so if it doesn't make sense, it's okay. It's the shadow that the story casts. Imagine in this picture, the sun is us. We're looking down. Our eyes are looking down at this tree. We're looking at the tree. It's an amazing tree. The shadow that's created by that sun is the theme. It's what the reader thinks about in terms of life, in terms of how the events point us towards something about life, or what the author's insight is about life. The shade of the tree. Maybe it makes sense, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Now, I think thinking about theme and finding theme isn't necessarily a hard thing to do. If you look at stories, you might have seen some of these common themes before, even the ones that we've read this semester. For example, war I think we saw a bit of that in The Interlopers and what Saki wanted to express about two warring families over a piece of land. Friendship. We could certainly connect. This is what it means to say Phoenix, Arizona, to friendship. Heritage. It's a huge part of everyday use. I think everyday use is trying to say something about family heritage. Human relationships. Cathedral. What do we learn in that story about how people interact and how people get along? Prejudice, too, with Cathedral as well. So I think if we just looked at this list, which is in the PowerPoint here, and it's in the PowerPoint that's in the weekly notes, you can find some stories that connect with themes. The hard thing about theme isn't finding the connections. The hard thing about theme is what the story is trying to say about that big idea. So what is Cathedral trying to say about prejudice or human relationships? What is everyday use trying to say about heritage? What is Saki's The Interlopers trying to say about war and family? So that's where it gets a little tricky, but also interesting. I think this week you're going to see The Things They Carried, very much a story about war, and certainly about human relationships and even love. I think you're going to see Bounty, a story about human relationships, a story about selfishness and community. Not that hard to think about it in that terms, but when you start thinking, what is the story trying to say about those things, it gets a little challenging. But thank God we can turn to the evidence. And what's the evidence? We can look at characters. So we know different kinds of characters, dynamic characters, who changes, who grows, who learns. Maybe what they learn is connected to that theme idea. Character names sometimes, or character thoughts, or character actions can all come to reveal what the theme is. Sometimes the title. Interlopers means somebody who interferes in the affairs of another. We could find a lot of connections. We could find a lot of interlopers in that story, including us even thinking about the story. We're kind of interlopers. The setting. Setting is a huge part of stories. We know what it can do. It can tell us about character. It can be a conflict. It can be an antagonist. It can be a symbol. It can embody theme. So look for what Tim O'Brien's trying to say about war and the things they carried in his descriptions of the setting. How is he using that setting? What is that setting doing in that story? Symbols, we'll talk a lot more about those next week. Those are usually items, but also actions that come to resonate in meaningful ways. Things that people say, dialogue, important sentences, those are always great parts to look at when you're thinking about theme. All right. I think that's what I got for you here on theme. As you're reading the stories for this week and thinking about the stories we've already read, ask yourself, what is the big idea about life in this story? What does the author want to express in this story about the world we live in, or how we live our life, or what's important in life? You can think about this week's stories, but you can also think about the ones we've read the last 3 weeks. Coming up in a few weeks, we'll be working on an essay about theme, and you're going to choose a story to explore its theme. So if there's one that's kind of, staying with you, I know I got a lot of positive feedback about at the Round Earth's Imagined Corners. You could start writing about theme for this week's discussion, and even use that as a place to play with some ideas that you might be able to bring to the essay in a few weeks. If there's any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. If you didn't listen to my announcement, please listen to my announcement. I explained some things about the grading and quizzes. It was a little confusing last week. I got a lot of emails about it. I wish you all the best and take care of yourselves. I'll be talking to you very soon.